Ever fire off an email, trying to be all brief and to the point, and the person writes back with a, whoa there, did I do something wrong? Just because you didn't, drown it in exclamation points.
Yeah, the classic struggle of tone and writing, right?
Yeah,
It really shows how much we depend on those little cues to figure out what someone really means.
totally.
Yeah.
But it's wild how not everyone's on the same page about that whole vocal performance thing. That's actually what our deep dive today is all about: autistic communication. Specifically, how autistic people use and understand prosody.
By prosody, we mean like the music of how we talk. That's your intonation, rhythm, all the things that layer meaning onto the words themselves.
And our guide for this deep dive is Jamie Horrocks, PhD, and their article, Maybe We're Just Not That Into You: A Snarky Look at Prosody, Autism, and Who Really Cares What We Sound Like.
Okay, that title alone tells you you're in for a thought-provoking ride.
Right, you can say that again. And Horrocks doesn't mess around. They jump right in, saying that instead of obsessing over how to sound, autistic individuals are often focused on something else entirely. Just being clear.
Exactly. It's not about putting on a show. It's about getting the message across crystal clear. In fact, the article even says autistic people rarely criticize each other's tone of voice. They're all about the content. Did you get what I meant? Are we on the same wavelength?
Which, now that you mention it, is super direct and efficient when you think about it. Horrocks even has this great line: for many autistic people, communication isn't a social dance, it's about building a shared understanding.
I love that. And that focus on clarity, as Herrick says, it can be a real strength in a lot of situations. Imagine technical writing, coding, legal stuff, anywhere. Accuracy is key, and all that emotional subtext can actually muddy the waters.
Makes total sense. But let's be real, the world doesn't always reward directness, right? The article talks about this intense pressure autistic people feel to sound neurotypical, this constant effort of masking, of changing their natural way of speaking to blend in.
Yeah, and that masking comes at a cost. Think about the emotional energy it takes to constantly be policing your tone, your pacing, all to meet these unspoken social rules.
It's exhausting just imagining it. And it sends this message that who you are, how you naturally talk, isn't good enough. Like, you need to change to fit our norms.
Which brings up a big question then. Whose comfort are we really putting first? Who benefits from forcing one group's communication style on everyone else? Because it's clearly not the autistic person being told to silence their authentic voice.
And it's not just like society at large either, right? Horrocks even calls out the role of parents, autism moms, they call them, who get super focused on fixing their autistic kids' way of speaking.
Yeah, that's a whole other layer of complexity, isn't it? Because, I mean, any parent can relate to wanting your kid to, I don't know, navigate the world a little easier, avoid misunderstanding.
Totally get that, but like Horrocks points out, a lot of it comes from the parents' own anxieties.
Right.
It's their fear of being judged, like, what will people think of my kid, of me for being their parent?
Yeah, there's a real sadness to that. Because it keeps pushing this narrative that autistic communication is broken, something to be fixed, instead of just different. And what's even more concerning, Horrocks talks about how this drive to make autistic kids normal often shapes where the money for autism therapies ends up going.
Oh, really? What do you mean?
Well, they say a huge chunk of funding goes towards therapies that are basically trying to make autistic kids seem more neurotypical. And often that comes at the expense of therapies that could be helping them learn life skills, stuff to support their well-being overall. Raises some ethical flags about who we're actually helping here.
It's like we're prioritizing fitting a certain mold over actually supporting and accepting them.
Exactly. And it circles back to what we were saying before. Whose comfort are we putting first? Are we actually helping these individuals thrive, or are we just making them more palatable to a society that rather have conformity over neurodiversity?
Man, that's a question that'll stick with you. But Horrocks doesn't stop there. They take this whole discussion about artistic communication even further, introducing this concept of Gestalt language processing.
And this is where it gets super interesting on like a cognitive level.
Yeah.
So Gestalt language processing, GLP for short, suggests that autistic people might not just communicate differently, they might actually process language in a whole different way.
Okay, I'm not going to lie. When I first read that, I was like, hold on, what now? Could you maybe unpack that a little?
Absolutely. Think of it like this. Imagine reading an email. Someone with analytic language processing, or ALP, they'll likely process it kind of linearly, right? Focusing on the individual words, the sentences, really analyzing the tone of each phrase.
Got it. So it's like they're doing a close reading, super tuned into all the little details.
Right. But someone with GLP, they might experience that same email as one big chunk of information. They're getting the overall message, the intention behind it, without necessarily fixating on the individual pieces of language the same way.
So it's like they're seeing the forest, not getting lost in all the individual trees.
Perfect analogy. And this is exactly why Horrocks says that GLP is such a game changer in how we understand autistic communication. Because if someone's brain is processing language in these holistic chunks, then all those subtle vocal cues, the stuff neurotypical people often get hung up on, they might not even register as important.
So it's not that they don't hear the tone, it's that their brain's kind of wired to prioritize the bigger picture. That's really something. It makes you wonder how important all those vocal nuances really are in the grand scheme of communication, you know?
Exactly. And that's what Horrocks is saying. Traditional research often misses this whole other way of processing, so it ends up drawing the wrong conclusions about how autistic people communicate.
Which actually makes me think of another point Horrocks made that really struck me, the lack of autistic researchers, like actually involved in autism research. I'm going to quote them here. They say, if we want to understand autistic communication, who better to ask than autistic people themselves?
It seems obvious when you hear it like that, right?
Yep.
But, as Horrocks points out, autistic voices are often pushed aside in the very places where their experiences are being studied and picked apart.
Like trying to understand a whole book without ever talking to the author, you know what I mean? So like taking all of this and this idea of GLP, the focus on clarity over performance, the pressure to mask, where do we even go from here? How do we actually use this information?
Well, Horrocks ends with a really powerful call to action. It's a plea to stop trying to fix autistic individuals and start trying to actually understand and accept them. They say that instead of trying to erase these differences, we should be celebrating the richness and the diversity they bring.
So it's about recognizing that there's not just one right way to communicate, one right way to experience the world, right?
Exactly. And that takes a real shift in thinking. It means questioning all those ingrained assumptions about what's considered normal communication, about what makes a good communicator, all of it.
So less about specific techniques and more about checking our own biases.
100%. It starts with just noticing those unconscious biases we might have about how people talk, and then really challenging those biases. Like asking ourselves, why does it make me uncomfortable if someone communicates differently?
Because in the end, embracing neurodiversity, it's not about just being nice or politically correct, right? It's about creating a world where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued for who they truly are. Horrocks puts it so well. It's time to listen to autistic voices in all their diversity and recognize the unique contributions they made to our understanding of communication, connection, and the human experience.
And that listening has to happen on so many levels. It's about individuals making the effort to truly hear each other, to be patient with different ways of communicating.
It's about researchers designing studies that actually include the full range of autistic experiences, making sure autistic people are involved every step of the way.
And it's about building systems that support neurodiversity, period. Whether that's funding therapies that are actually inclusive or creating learning environments that work for different ways of learning and processing information.
Because a world that values those differences, a world that embraces the people who think and communicate differently, that's a richer, more interesting, and ultimately way more innovative world for all of us.
Couldn't agree more.
So as you go through your day, your week, keep that challenge from Horrocks in mind. How can you actively listen to and value autistic voices? How could that change your understanding of communication and connection? It's a question worth sitting with, and even more importantly, it's a question worth acting on.